The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Marine Sergeant Sarah Chen adjusted her rifle scope. She had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Kandahar for 8 months, serving as one of the few female snipers in her unit. The 480 Marines of the 3rd Battalion were preparing for what intelligence reports called a routine patrol mission in the Helmand province. Sarah's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, gathered the troops in the main briefing tent. The air was thick with tension and the smell of strong coffee. Maps covered every surface, marked with red circles indicating known enemy positions. Rodriguez pointed to a valley marked on the satellite images, explaining that local Afghan forces had requested assistance in clearing out suspected Taliban fighters who had been disrupting supply routes. The mission seemed straightforward enough. 3 companies would advance through different routes, converging on the target area by nightfall. Sarah's sniper team would provide overwatch from the eastern ridge, giving them a clear view of the entire operation. Her spotter, Corporal Jake Williams, had worked with her for 2 years. They communicated with just glances and hand signals, a partnership forged through countless hours of training and previous missions. As the convoy of armored vehicles rolled out of the base, Sarah felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and focused calm that came before every operation. She checked her M40A5 sniper rifle for the 100th time, ensuring every component was perfect. The weapon had become an extension of herself, and she could hit targets at distances that amazed even veteran Marines. The intelligence had been wrong from the start. What should have been a small group of insurgents turned out to be a well-organized force of over 300 enemy fighters. They had been waiting, watching the American patrol routes for weeks. The Taliban had set up a carefully planned ambush using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. The first sign of trouble came when the lead vehicle hit an improvised explosive device. The explosion echoed through the valley like thunder, and immediately enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and small arms fire rained down on the Marines from hidden positions in the rocks and caves. Sarah watched through her scope as chaos erupted below. The 3 companies found themselves pinned down in a kill zone with no clear escape route. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves on the high ground, giving them perfect fields of fire into the valley where the Marines were trapped. Radio chatter filled with urgent calls for air support and medical evacuation. From her position on the eastern ridge, Sarah could see the full scope of the ambush. The enemy had used the terrain masterfully, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement nearly impossible for the trapped Marines. Her training kicked in as she began identifying priority targets through her scope, but she knew that even her exceptional marksmanship skills would only make a small dent in the overwhelming enemy force. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. Calm despite the desperate situation, air support was at least 30 minutes away, and the Marines were taking heavy casualties. Several vehicles were destroyed, and medical supplies were running dangerously low. The enemy seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were showing no signs of retreating. As the battle intensified, Sarah realized that this was unlike any mission she had experienced before. The enemy was well-trained, well-equipped, and had chosen their battlefield perfectly. The 480 Marines who had left the base that morning were now fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and traditional military tactics were proving ineffective against such a well-prepared ambush. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountains as Sarah prepared for what would become the longest and most challenging day of her military career. She had no way of knowing that the decisions she would make in the coming hours would determine whether her fellow Marines would make it home, alive, or become another tragic statistic in a war that had already claimed too many lives. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the temperature in the valley began to rise, adding another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. Sarah wiped the sweat from her eyes and focused her scope on the enemy positions, knowing that every shot she took could mean the difference between life and death for the Marines trapped below. The ambush had been raging for 2 hours, and the situation was becoming desperate. Sarah counted at least 15 Marines who had been wounded or killed in the initial attack. The enemy fighters showed no signs of letting up, and their ammunition seemed endless. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes coming from at least 20 different positions scattered across the mountainside. Corporal Williams, her spotter, was scanning the battlefield with his binoculars when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A large group of enemy reinforcements was moving through a hidden canyon, preparing to flank the trapped Marines from the south. If they succeeded, the entire battalion would be completely surrounded with no hope of escape. Sarah's radio crackled with increasingly urgent messages from the company commanders. First Company had lost their commanding officer to a sniper's bullet, and their senior sergeant was trying to coordinate a defense with limited ammunition. Second Company was pinned down behind 2 destroyed vehicles, using them as cover while enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. The most troubling news came from Third Company, which had been separated from the main group during the initial explosion. They were trapped in a narrow ravine with wounded Marines who couldn't be moved. Their medic was doing everything possible to keep the injured alive, but without medical evacuation, several Marines wouldn't survive the next hour. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez made a difficult decision over the radio. He ordered all units to fall back to a more defensible position near a cluster of large rocks in the center of the valley. The movement would be dangerous, requiring Marines to cross open ground under heavy enemy fire. But staying in their current positions meant certain death. Sarah watched through her scope as small groups of Marines began the treacherous movement across the valley floor. Enemy snipers immediately targeted anyone who moved, and several Marines were hit before reaching the relative safety of the rocks. The enemy seemed to anticipate every tactical move the Americans made, suggesting they had been planning this ambush for weeks or even months. The situation became even more critical when Sarah realized that the enemy had anti-aircraft weapons positioned on the peaks surrounding the valley. 2 Apache helicopters that had been dispatched to provide close air support were forced to retreat after taking heavy fire from shoulder-fired missiles. The Marines were truly on their own. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, dehydration and heat exhaustion began affecting the trapped Marines. Many had already consumed their entire water supply, and the enemy controlled all the water sources in the area. The psychological pressure was enormous, with some younger Marines showing signs of panic despite their training. Sarah's ammunition was running low, but she had been making every shot count. Through careful target selection, she had eliminated 12 enemy fighters, including 2 who appeared to be commanders based on their positions and the way other fighters responded to them. However, for every enemy fighter she eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. The radio brought more bad news when the forward air controller announced that close air support had been delayed indefinitely due to bad weather moving into the area. The thick clouds and high winds made precision bombing too dangerous with friendly forces so close to enemy positions. The Marines would have to hold their ground for at least another 4 hours. Williams pointed out a new threat developing on the western slope. A team of enemy fighters was setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun position that would give them a direct line of fire into the Marines' defensive position. Once operational, the weapon would make their current cover useless and force another dangerous movement across open ground. Sarah studied the enemy machine gun team through her scope. Calculating distance, wind speed, and elevation, the shot would be at the extreme range of her rifle, over 800 meters through difficult mountain air. She would have only one opportunity before the enemy spotted her muzzle, flash and returned fire on her position. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders as she realized that the lives of 480 Marines might depend on her ability to make an impossible shot. The enemy machine gun crew was almost finished setting up their weapon, and once they opened fire, the Marines' defensive position would become a death trap. Sarah controlled her breathing and settled into her firing position, feeling the familiar calm that came over her during critical moments. The crosshairs of her scope centered on the enemy gunner's chest as she began her final calculations. Everything she had learned in sniper school and through years of combat experience had led to this single moment where one bullet could change the course of the entire battle. Sarah's finger slowly squeezed the trigger, and the rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through her scope, she watched the enemy gunner collapse backward, his body falling away from the heavy machine gun. The other crew members looked around in confusion, unsure where the shot had come from. Before they could react, Sarah had already chambered another round and eliminated the ammunition carrier. The elimination of the machine gun threat bought the Marines precious time, but Sarah knew it was only temporary. The enemy would soon realize where the shots had come from and direct their attention toward her position. Williams was already scanning for their next firing position, knowing they would have to move quickly to avoid becoming targets themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with new orders. He had identified a possible escape route through a narrow canyon to the north, but it would require someone to eliminate 3 enemy sniper positions that controlled the high ground overlooking the passage. The shots would have to be made quickly and accurately, as the enemy would immediately focus their fire on anyone attempting to help the trapped Marines. Sarah studied the 3 enemy positions through her scope. Each sniper was well concealed, among the rocks, visible only by the occasional muzzle flash when they fired at the Marines below. The distances varied from 600 to nearly 900 meters, and the targets would be aware and ready after she fired the first shot. The pressure was enormous. If she missed any of the 3 shots, the enemy snipers would pin down the GI, Marines attempting to escape through the canyon, turning the narrow passage into a killing field. She would have perhaps 30 seconds to eliminate all 3 targets before they could adjust their positions and return effective fire. Williams provided range and wind estimates for each target as Sarah prepared for the most challenging shooting sequence of her career. The first target was positioned behind a large boulder with only his rifle scope visible. The second had taken cover in a cave entrance, showing only the upper portion of his body. The third was the most difficult, located in an elevated position where only his head and shoulders could be seen. Sarah fired at the first target, watching through her scope as the enemy sniper slumped forward over his rifle. She immediately shifted to the second position, adjusting for the different range and elevation. The bullet struck the cave entrance, and the enemy fighter disappeared from view. Whether he was dead or simply wounded, he was no longer a threat to the Marines below. The third shot was the most critical. The enemy sniper had heard the first 2 shots and was already moving to a new position. Sarah had to lead the target, predicting where he would be when her bullet arrived. She fired, and through her scope, she saw the enemy fighter stumble and fall from his elevated perch. The elimination of the 3 enemy snipers created the opening Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez needed. He ordered 1st Company to begin moving toward the canyon while 2nd and 3rd Companies provided covering fire. The movement had to be perfectly coordinated, with each Marine knowing exactly when to move and where to go. Sarah continued providing overwatch as the Marines began their fighting withdrawal. Enemy fighters immediately recognized what was happening and increased their rate of fire, trying to prevent the Americans from reaching the canyon entrance. Bullets ricocheted off rocks and sent dust clouds into the air as the Marines bounded from cover to cover. The first group of Marines reached the canyon entrance, but enemy reinforcements were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah could see, through her scope, that a large group of fighters was moving to cut off the escape route before all the Marines could reach safety. The enemy understood that this was their last chance to prevent the Americans from escaping the kill zone. Williams spotted another threat developing on the eastern slope. A team of enemy fighters was carrying what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, positioning themselves to fire into the canyon entrance. If they succeeded, the narrow passage would become blocked with rubble, trapping any Marines still in the valley. Sarah quickly calculated the range to the RPG team and fired without hesitation. The round struck the fighter carrying the launcher, but another enemy immediately picked up the weapon. She fired again, eliminating the second threat, but more fighters were moving to replace them. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate as ammunition ran low, and enemy fighters seemed to emerge from every shadow and cave in the mountainside. Sarah realized that the Marines might escape the initial kill zone only to find themselves trapped in the canyon, with limited ammunition and no air support. Radio chatter indicated that several wounded Marines were having difficulty making the movement to the canyon. The battalion's medic was moving between positions under heavy fire, trying to stabilize the injured enough for them to be moved. Every minute of delay increased the chances that the enemy would successfully cut off the escape route. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of the battle. Instead of continuing to provide defensive fire from her current position, she would move closer to the action where she could have a greater impact on the enemy's ability to pursue the escaping Marines. It was an incredibly dangerous plan that went against standard sniper doctrine, but desperate situations required desperate measures. Sarah told Williams her plan over the radio, but he immediately objected. Moving closer to the enemy would expose them to direct fire from multiple directions, and they would lose the advantage of their elevated position. However, Sarah had identified a rock formation about 400 meters closer to the battle that would give her clear shots at the enemy fighters trying to cut off the Marine escape route. Against Williams's protests, Sarah began moving down the mountainside, using every piece of available cover to avoid detection. The sound of gunfire grew louder as she approached the battle, and she could hear the shouts of Marines coordinating their movements through the canyon. Enemy bullets whined overhead as she dove behind a cluster of rocks. From her new position, Sarah had a much clearer view of the enemy movements. She could see that a large group of fighters was attempting to circle around the canyon entrance to ambush the Marines from behind. If they succeeded, the entire battalion would be caught in a crossfire with no way to escape. Sarah began systematically eliminating the enemy fighters who posed the greatest threat to the escaping Marines. Her first target was an enemy commander who was directing fighters from a position behind a large rock. The shot was clean, and immediately the coordinated enemy assault began to falter as subordinate fighters looked around in confusion. Williams had followed Sarah, despite his concerns, and was now providing spotting information from a position about 50 meters away. Through his binoculars, he could see enemy fighters attempting to set up an ambush position at a bend in the canyon where the Marines would be most vulnerable. Sarah adjusted her aim and fired, eliminating the lead fighter before the ambush could be established. The enemy began to realize that their casualties were coming from a single sniper who had moved much closer to the battle than any of them had expected. Several fighters began moving towards Sarah's position, forcing her to divide her attention between supporting the Marine withdrawal and defending her own location. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with an urgent update. The majority of his Marines had successfully entered the canyon, but a rear guard of 30 Marines was still pinned down in the valley, providing covering fire for the withdrawal. They were running critically low on ammunition and would need to move soon, or risk being overrun by superior numbers. Sarah could see the rear guard through her scope. They were positioned behind the wreckage of 2 vehicles, surrounded by enemy fighters who were slowly closing in from all sides. The Marines were fighting desperately but without support. They would be overwhelmed within minutes. Making another split-second decision, Sarah left her concealed position and moved to higher ground where she would have a better angle on the enemy fighters surrounding the rear guard. The movement exposed her to enemy fire, and bullets immediately began striking the rocks around her as she climbed. Williams provided covering fire with his rifle, engaging enemy fighters who were trying to target Sarah during her movement. His shots weren't as precise as hers, but they were enough to keep enemy heads down and allow her to reach a new firing position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. From her new position, Sarah could see the entire battlefield clearly. The 30 Marines of the rear guard were completely surrounded, with enemy fighters advancing from 4 different directions. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the enemy would be close enough to overrun the American position with small arms fire. Sarah began firing rapidly, switching between targets with mechanical precision. Each shot eliminated an enemy fighter who was advancing on the trapped Marines. Her rate of fire was much faster than standard sniper doctrine recommended, but the situation demanded speed over the luxury of careful target selection. The enemy fighters began to realize that their advance was being decimated by accurate sniper fire, but they couldn't immediately identify Sarah's new position. Several fighters began firing randomly at rocks and shadows, hoping to suppress the sniper who was causing such devastating casualties among their ranks. Williams reported over the radio that more enemy reinforcements were approaching from the west, including what appeared to be fighters carrying heavy weapons. If these reinforcements reached the battle, even Sarah's exceptional marksmanship wouldn't be enough to save the trapped rear guard. The Marines in the canyon were making good progress through the narrow passage, but the rocky terrain was slowing their movement. Several wounded Marines required assistance, and the medic was doing everything possible to keep them mobile. Every minute the rear guard could hold their position gave the main force a better chance of reaching safety. Sarah's ammunition was running dangerously low. She had started the mission with 60 rounds and was down to her last magazine. Each shot had to count, as there would be no resupply, until the Marines could establish a secure perimeter somewhere outside the valley. The enemy seemed to sense that the Americans were running low on ammunition, and began pressing their attacks more aggressively. Enemy fighters who had been cautious earlier were now advancing in the open, trusting in their superior numbers to overwhelm the remaining Marine resistance. Sarah realized that conventional sniper tactics would not be sufficient to save the rear guard. She would need to do something unprecedented, something that would create enough confusion and casualties among the enemy to allow the 30 trapped Marines to break contact and reach the canyon entrance. The plan forming in her mind was incredibly dangerous and went against everything she had been taught about sniper operations. Sarah made a decision that would be studied in military academies for years to come. Instead of remaining in her concealed position and picking off individual targets, she would expose herself deliberately to draw enemy fire away from the trapped rear guard. By making herself a high-value target, she could force the enemy to divide their attention and resources. She moved to the highest point of the rocky outcrop, making herself visible to enemy fighters throughout the valley. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of weapons turned toward her position, sending a storm of bullets crashing into the rocks around her. The sound was deafening, like being inside a thunderstorm made of metal and gunpowder. Williams screamed over the radio for Sarah to take cover, but she continued firing methodically at enemy fighters, drawing more and more attention to her position. Her plan was working perfectly. The enemy had shifted their focus from the 30 trapped Marines to the single sniper, who had been causing such devastating casualties throughout the battle. The rearguard Marines immediately recognized the opportunity Sarah had created for them. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, the senior non-commissioned officer leading the group, ordered his Marines to begin bounding movements toward the canyon entrance. They moved in small teams, using the distraction Sarah had created to cross open ground that had been impossible to traverse minutes earlier. Sarah continued firing, despite the overwhelming enemy response directed at her position. She could see through her scope that her shots were still finding their targets, eliminating key enemy fighters and disrupting their coordinated attacks on the escaping Marines. However, she knew that her position was becoming increasingly untenable as enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. Williams had moved to a position where he could provide some covering fire for Sarah, but his rifle was not designed for long-range precision shooting. He engaged targets of opportunity, trying to suppress enemy fighters who were getting too close to Sarah's position. His shots were more about harassment than elimination, but every enemy fighter who had to take cover was one less weapon firing at Sarah. The enemy began using rocket-propelled grenades to try to dislodge Sarah from her rocky perch. The first RPG missed by 20 meters, exploding against the mountainside and sending a shower of rock fragments in all directions. The second was closer, detonating just below her position and filling the air with smoke and debris. Sarah's ears were ringing from the explosions, but she continued firing. Her scope had been damaged by rock fragments, making precise shots more difficult, but she could still see well enough to engage targets at medium range. Every shot had to count now. As she was down to her final few rounds of ammunition, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter, with news that the rear guard was making good progress toward the canyon entrance. 25 of the 30 Marines had successfully disengaged from their positions and were moving under cover toward safety. Only 5 Marines remained pinned down, including one who was seriously wounded and couldn't move without assistance. Sarah could see the 5 remaining Marines through the smoke and dust. They were trapped behind a destroyed vehicle, with enemy fighters advancing from 3 sides. The wounded Marine appeared to be unconscious, and his fellow Marines were taking turns providing medical care while maintaining defensive fire. With only 3 rounds remaining in her rifle, Sarah had to make an impossible choice. She could use her ammunition to provide covering fire for the 5 trapped Marines, or she could save it to defend her own position as enemy fighters climbed toward her rocky outcrop. Either choice would likely result in casualties that could have been prevented. Sarah chose to support her fellow Marines. She fired her remaining 3 rounds at enemy fighters who were closest to overrunning the 5 Marines' position. Each shot found its target, eliminating immediate threats and buying precious time for a rescue attempt. However, this left her completely defenseless as enemy fighters closed in on her position. Williams saw what was happening and made his own heroic decision. He left his concealed position and ran toward the 5 trapped Marines, firing his rifle and throwing grenades to create a corridor for their escape. His actions drew enemy fire away from both Sarah and the trapped Marines, but exposed him to devastating crossfire. The 5 Marines used Williams' distraction to begin carrying their wounded comrade toward the canyon entrance. They moved as quickly as possible, but the injured Marine's dead weight slowed their progress considerably. Enemy fighters were recovering from Williams's surprise attack and beginning to pursue the escaping Americans. Sarah watched helplessly as her spotter and friend exposed himself to enemy fire to save Marines he had never met. Williams was hit twice but continued moving, using his body to shield the wounded Marine from enemy bullets. His courage and selflessness embodied everything the Marine Corps represented. The canyon entrance was only 100 meters away, but it might as well have been 1,000. Enemy fighters were converging on the escaping Marines from multiple directions, and Williams was losing blood rapidly from his wounds. Sarah could see that without immediate intervention, none of the 6 Marines would reach safety. With no ammunition remaining in her rifle, Sarah drew her sidearm and began moving down from her rocky position toward the valley floor. It was a desperate move that went against all tactical logic, but she could not watch her fellow Marines die when there might be something she could do to help them reach safety. The enemy immediately shifted their fire toward her, recognizing the sniper who had caused so much devastation throughout the day. Sarah's movement down the mountainside drew intense enemy fire, but it also created the distraction Williams and the 5 Marines needed to reach the canyon entrance. She fired her pistol at enemy fighters, knowing that the 9mm rounds were ineffective at long range, but hoping to keep enemy heads down long enough for her fellow Marines to escape. The sound of approaching aircraft suddenly filled the valley as 2 F-18 Hornets screamed overhead. The weather had cleared enough for close air support to finally arrive, and the pilots immediately began engaging enemy positions with precision-guided munitions. The timing was perfect, as enemy fighters who had been pursuing the escaping Marines were caught in the open. Williams and the 5 Marines, including their wounded comrade, successfully reached the canyon entrance just as the first bombs began falling. The explosions echoed through the mountains, and enemy fire decreased significantly as fighters sought cover from the aerial attack. Sarah used the confusion to bound from rock to rock, making her way toward the canyon entrance. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez coordinated the airstrikes from his position deeper in the canyon, directing the pilots toward concentrations of enemy fighters and weapons positions. The F-18s made multiple passes, systematically destroying enemy strongholds that had made the Marines' situation so desperate. Throughout the long day, Sarah reached the canyon entrance as the last of the rear guard. Marines disappeared into the narrow passage. Williams was conscious but losing blood from multiple wounds. The battalion medic immediately began working on him, while other Marines provided security for the entrance to the canyon. The airstrikes continued for 20 minutes, targeting enemy positions throughout the valley and the surrounding mountains. When the bombing finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The Taliban fighters who had orchestrated such a devastating ambush had either been killed, wounded, or scattered to distant hiding places. As the Marines began their movement through the canyon toward a landing zone where helicopters could evacuate casualties, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. The 480 Marines who had left the base that morning had faced overwhelming odds and survived through courage, teamwork, and exceptional marksmanship when it mattered most. Williams was evacuated on the first medical helicopter, along with 7 other seriously wounded Marines. Before being loaded onto the aircraft, he managed to tell Sarah that her decision to expose herself and draw enemy fire had saved not only the rear guard, but possibly the entire battalion. Her actions had turned what could have been a complete disaster into a successful fighting withdrawal. The official after-action report credited Sarah with 43 confirmed enemy kills during the 8-hour battle, but more importantly, it recognized her tactical decision to abandon standard sniper doctrine and adapt to the battlefield situation. Military analysts later determined that her actions had been the decisive factor in preventing the annihilation of the entire Marine force. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez recommended Sarah for the Silver Star, the military's 3rd highest decoration for valor in combat. The citation specifically mentioned her willingness to expose herself to enemy fire to save fellow Marines, demonstrating the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States military. 6 months later, Williams returned to active duty after recovering from his wounds. He and Sarah were assigned to train other Marine snipers, sharing the lessons learned from their experience in the Afghan mountains. Their story became part of Marine Corps sniper curriculum, demonstrating how tactical flexibility and selfless courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Sarah never considered herself a hero. In interviews years later, she insisted that she had simply done what any Marine would do in the same situation. However, military historians recognized her actions as a textbook example of how individual initiative and exceptional marksmanship could change the outcome of an entire battle. The 480 Marines who returned to base that evening owed their lives to many factors: effective leadership, coordinated teamwork, timely air support, and exceptional courage under fire. But many of them knew that without the actions of one woman sniper who refused to abandon her fellow Marines, they might never have seen another sunrise. Sarah continued her military career, eventually reaching the rank of gunnery sergeant before retiring after 20 years of service. She settled in a small town in Montana, where she occasionally spoke at military events about the importance of adapting to battlefield conditions and never giving up on fellow service members. The lessons learned from the battle in the Afghan mountains influenced Marine Corps tactics for years to come. Sarah's innovative use of aggressive sniper tactics in close support of infantry operations became standard doctrine, taught to new generations of Marine marksmen who might one day face similar impossible situations. The Taliban ambush had been designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces, but instead became a demonstration of Marine Corps values under extreme pressure. The story of 480 Marines who refused to surrender and one woman sniper who helped turn the tide became legendary within military circles, inspiring countless service members who heard it.